Okay, so my name is Sean Wildermuth, and today we're going to talk about Vue. I would ask people to raise their hands, but finding the button that actually raises your hand in Zoom is always weird. But for those of you who haven't worked with Vue, or especially who haven't worked with client-side JavaScript frameworks like Angular or React, there might be some things that are a little confusing here, but hopefully not, especially where we start to talk about it. It should be pretty simple, and when we get to some of the more complicated things, there may be more questions. We'll have time at the end for questions if you put them in the chat, and I'll sort of go through the questions in the chat when we get to that point, and let's get started. I'm an instructor, coach, and author. I've written a bunch of Pluralsight courses. I do some training on my own website. You can see the links here. I've made a film called the Hello World film that hopefully will be out internationally this fall about software developers. So hopefully that will be of interest to most of you. And so I want to start by talking about this notion of what the community calls a SPA. Now, when I talk about SPA, I'm really talking about single page applications. And this is the idea of having in the browser a rich sort of user interactive piece of code. It's not just displaying HTML, but it might be handling some user interaction. And a lot of what we deal with on the web has this sort of high interaction. But SPAs today are typically monolithic enterprise-y sort of apps. They're often built as one large application instead of websites, which are normally sort of page-based. And unfortunately, this acronym SPA has encouraged the community to sort of think about it monolithically, because we did call it single page applications. Not a big fan of the moniker. Something I kind of fought for multi-page applications or some other, there were about 15 different acronyms. That SPA was the one that stuck, and so I sort of lost that fight. There are consumer-facing SPAs out there. If you've ordered a pizza or if you've gone to Twitter or those sorts of things, they're often built in these sort of monolithic ways as well. And a lot of them want to just replace web navigation. And part of my pitch here is that that's not always a useful thing to do. SPAs can sort of centralize services in that doing things like calling APIs to get data or validating data, all that can be centralized. But I think there is a cost at thinking that my homepage is my entire web presence. I've seen things like blogs that are just a SPA that end up having to jump through a lot of hoops in order for Google to be able to put it in the results and other things by doing things like server-side rendering. Whereas I want to sort of embrace what the web does and then enhance that through these sort of applications. And this is what sort of drives me into the way I think the applications should be built. I think that SPAs, these monolithic approach at least, are typically overused. They actually are great for forms over data. So a lot of organizations are just using them to collect data or to report on data or to do things like dashboards. And that's really where they shine. But making a SPA into every website you have, sort of replacing what you would do at the server side, or replacing generating HTML and JavaScript and CSS by using a SPA, to me just feels silly. And so this is where I think Vue has a real answer, because when we look at the other sort of SPA frameworks that are out there, they sort of take a monolithic approach. They have a build. The build's going to produce either one giant app in Angular case or a number of components in sort of one package in React's face. And Vue can do that, but you don't have to. And I'm going to start simple and minimal, because that's what Vue can do. Vue starts very simple and minimal, and as you get into a larger and larger need, you can sort of scale it up. Vue is just JavaScript. There's no special magic to it. And you can still create full SPAs when, you can still create SPAs when a single monolithic application is just too much for what you want to do. And so we're going to see sort of both sides, the minimal and then sort of the scale up approach. This doesn't mean that I hate Angular and React. In fact, I still use Angular quite a bit in some projects. I've never been really a React person, but they just have different approaches, and I feel like Vue is sort of in the middle of them. taking sort of a middle ground. And I think the best way to describe this is this anatomy of what these apps look like. If you've done React, then you know that you have sort of your code, and then you have a JSX compiler that then goes to a Babel compiler that then goes to Webpack to put it all together, and then you can spit out this browser-ready code. And Angular is pretty much the same, except there isn't a JSX compiler. There's still a compiler and Webpack, and then you're producing your ready code. Vue doesn't require you to use a compiler at any point. You can do it all as just JavaScript. It does allow you to use TypeScript or an ES6 compiler like Babel, Webpack, but those are optional in the way that Vue works. It isn't relying on the compiler to make the code work. And that to me is sort of the magic there. In fact, in some cases, I'm using Vue to replace things like jQuery in my applications. Not creating these giant monolithic applications, but just adding some of that interactivity that we're used to with other libraries, and in an easier way that's easier to test. And I think Vue does that. And I think when we get to the code, which is pretty quick, you'll see that. Vue's philosophy has always been it wants to be able to scale up, and its goal is to only do what it has to. The framework itself is trying to do as little as possible to help you, because there isn't built into Vue anything that does validation or that does making API calls. Even their routing system is external to the core Vue. You can use theirs, you can use somebody else's. And it has some recommendations. It has this whole system of recommended packages, but you don't have to use them. If you're already using something else to do these sorts of things, it's fine with it. It wants to be good at what it does as a core philosophy and not necessarily try to handle everything the user does. In some ways, Vue reminds me of Java versus something like Angular is closer to sort of the .NET idea that most of what I'm going to need is going to be in the framework, and I'm only going to need to go out for some exceptions, where Java was, we're going to give you just the runtime, and then everything else is probably an open source project. And I know I'm talking to .NET developers. That isn't always a bad thing. You'll see that .NET Core is really moving to more of that approach. But that's a different talk. I talked myself into it. So what does Vue do if it doesn't do some of these common things I'm used to? It does this idea of declarative rendering, or rendering based on data. You can build components and you can pose via those components. There's one- and two-way binding, as you would expect. Has this idea of single file components where you can build a component in a single file, and I'll show you that a little later. And then has a way to extend it with plugins and mixins, and then somewhat filters, and I'll talk about filters when we get to the code. And its ecosystem is pretty large. It's one of the fastest growing projects on GitHub, and there's lots and lots and lots of support with third-party components as well as open source projects based on Vue. So it has a lot of things going for it. The big thing it doesn't have going for it is it wasn't written by Facebook or Google, and that's either a good or a bad thing. Angular coming out of Google and React coming out of Facebook means they have a lot of developers sitting in rooms being paid a yearly wage to build and maintain this. And Vue doesn't have that behind it right now. It has a small team that is using sponsorships to do most of their funding, and they've been really, really successful being able to do that. But if having a big company behind you, that is a risk in Vue if that's important to you. So the rest of this is going to be code. I hate even sharing one slide, but I thought it'd be good to get us off on the right foot. So anyone with their mic still on, can you tell me whether you can see my Visual Studio screen?
Yeah, we can.
Great.
All good.
Good. So I'm just in a simple ASP.NET MVC project. I'm actually using core here, but all the things I'm going to be talking about, it doesn't matter whether it's core or not core. The way it's going to work is pretty similar. So I have let's go ahead and run this real quick. I have just a simple page here that does all server-side rendering right now. We haven't introduced anything about Vue. If you go clockwise, it speeds it up. I don't know if you know that. It's a handy trick to know about. Even the browser could be sped up by going clockwise. course, I don't know how fast my my mouse is being rendered. And so we just have a small, like a bed and breakfast with a couple of rooms that you can book. And there's no functionality built into it yet, but we have just the look and feel. And that's all happening on this page. I just have a for each, and I'm just building each of these from data in a database that I want to switch this over to Vue. So let's talk about how I would start. Because it is client side, I'm just going to use the section for scripts, which is, there's a section on my master page that says, if you want to inject scripts into the bottom of every of this page, put them in a section called scripts. That's specific to the way MVC does it, but if you've done it before, it should be pretty obvious. And I'm going to go get Vue, and I've gotten Vue by using NPM, that you can get the Vue scripts any way you want. I'm just using NPM as sort of an easy way to get them. And I'll drag that onto my page. In Visual Studio, not knowing anything about NPM, I'm going to need to fix this a little. Just give it some other types of slashes. And I'm also going to add onto this page a JavaScript file that I'm going to use. And so let me go into my www root, and I'm just going to create a new file called index, which is the name of this page, .js, right? So it's just JavaScript, so I know where I'm at. And I'm just going to include this on this page so that we're running both my code plus the code from Vue. And so to start with Vue, all I really need to do is create a new Vue object. And the Vue object is going to take a JavaScript object to specify some things in it. But it also is going to say, allow you to say $mount, which is say that this object that's going to represent some things, I want you to put onto the page or take control of some part of the page based on the CSS selector. And I'm just going to call it the app, for lack of a better name. So I'm going to need something called the app here. So let's come down here and let's create another row so we don't have to deal with multiple columns. And I'll just create a div here and give it the ID of the app, right? And so we're basically telling in the JavaScript in the Vue object to take over this part of our page. So let's go back to here and let's do the first thing that most people do inside of a Vue object, which is say, what kind of data do I want to be able to manipulate on the page? And I'm just going to put a simple piece of data called my name, right? And so on our page, we can just use double curly braces to be able to get at that data object essentially as the root object. So if I put name here, this will just inject it onto the page for me. This is sort of the super basics of data binding with Vue. Build up this Vue object that has the notion of some data, and then go ahead and mount it on that page. And if I go back to our page and refresh, you'll see Sean is showing up right here, right? Because I've bound it to that object. And let's go ahead and add in here actually add another row here. We get the right display, but this is much more about the way the Bootstrap works. I just want to be able to put it above all our stuff. Okay. That should be in the template of my demo, but it's not. And then I'm going to create a second object here. I'll just put it in a div. And I'm going to just put a button here and say, I'll just say, click me. And I'm just going to style them because I can't stand not styling them. And so we should have, if I'm lucky, Sean and then a button at the top of our page, right? Well, I'm glad that these are covering it, but oh. Med 12. Make sure that fixes it. I don't want you to not be able to see what I'm doing. So if I want to actually handle an event here, I can actually use a syntax called v dash, and v dash are a number of attributes that you can add onto your elements to interact with that Vue object. As long as it's inside the app, it'll pay attention to it. And v on is saying on some event. In this case, I want to say when someone clicks my button, I want to do something like add to name, right? This is just a piece of JavaScript that will be executed that I can run back here. So here I'm going to say methods as another section of my Vue object, and I'm going to say add to name, and I can just make it a function, and I'll just say this pointer for this object ends up being including everything in the data. So I can just say name equals this dot name plus underscore, right? And so this doesn't know where any of this is hosted. It's just changing its internal model of it. And if I've done it right, which I didn't because I Pascal cased it, we run this. Then every time I press click me, you'll see that it gets a little longer. It might be a little hard to see on your screens. And so this is the sort of the 101 of what Vue is doing here for you, allowing you to write code that doesn't necessarily know about the markup that is in the CSS, but that I could still test. I could still run tests to say add name should look like name plus the underscore, and I'd know that that was sane. And I could have done this all with jQuery, but it just becomes a little bit more sane to keep my markup and my actual code separate. And that's one of the things I like about the way Vue does this. And I like it because I can really start with this very almost jQuery methodology around it. I'm going to add a library I need, and I'm going to add this other thing I need, and just be able to go about it. And a lot of what I want to do is built into that. This is fine until you need, until your scripts become like 40 scripts because you're using all sorts of different libraries, and you're using a bunch of different components in those pages. And so as we scale up, the option is, I'm going to get rid of this for a minute, is actually go to a full build. And so in the client directory here, I've already asked the Vue CLI to build a project for me, just because there can be a lot of network time getting packages. I wanted to sort of avoid that. But what it's done is it's created a directory that I can run a build from. And in fact, I'm doing this at the command line now. If I use the Vue CLI, I can say things like Vue new to create a new project or to create a new component, but instead I'm actually using npm to say run a command called watch. And all that watch is doing is running this script for me. It's just sort of a shortcut. It's saying, Vue, I want you to build this for me. I want it to be for development, and then I want you to rebuild it every time I make a change to a file. And that part is so that I can seamlessly keep on changing my code behind the scenes, and it'll continue anytime I make that change to rebuild it or to show an error in that case. And it really just builds these two files. And notice I'm building them in just a root directory of www because it's just JavaScript I'm using. So let's comment these out. So we're not going to use these anymore because what ends up being in this app folder is chunk vendors is all the Vue or other vendor specific code included, and then the app is just the code that I've written. So I need to bring the chunk vendors up and then my app up. And what this app represents is in this source directory. So all the JavaScript or TypeScript that I want to use for Vue ends up being in the simple source folder. And so main.js is where this starts. And this is a lot like what we saw before. We're still using render, we're still using mount, but instead of having its own sort of data, it's actually saying, go grab this component and just render it in that spot. And this is the beginning of sort of composition or component-based development in Vue, where you're going to have components that contain components that contain components. And one of the things I like once you're starting to use the build system is you can use this parlor trick called a single page application. I'm sorry, I know I was going to do that. A single file component. And so a single file component ends with the .vue ending and just basically has 3 sections. All of them are optional. One is template, one is script, and one is style. So template is the HTML that you're going to be working with, that it's going to be the working part of it. The script is just that code like we wrote earlier, data and methods and all that sort of thing. And then style is for CSS, any CSS you need that is localized just to this component. And so it does use namespacing in CSS to, instead of having to have one giant CSS, you can use local CSS. But in our very simple example, I'm not doing that. And so all I'm doing so far, David?
Yeah, it's a quick question. Like, do they have to be in the same file? Could you split them out?
Yeah, you don't have to use single page components. You can just have CS files and .html files as well. It'll work just fine. So this is an optional idea. Some people don't like the idea of mixing the two because they're sort of localized, and because components usually are small. I don't mind it that much. But certainly it's a culture difference, not a necessity. By not using, like I said, this is a parlor trick. Essentially during the build, it goes, oh, we have an HTML file. Oh, we have a JavaScript file, and oh, we have a CSS file, and I'll just make it all work. That's why I called it a parlor trick.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. So all we're starting with data is just a collection of rooms, because we're going to duplicate what we saw in on the client side here, on the server side here on the client side. And so if we run this and we change the main to look at the app, which is that, again, that ID of the element that I want to be responsible for, all you should see in it is just saying, hey, Vue is working, because we're not doing anything magical here. And if I go and refresh, this will go away because I commented out all that code. And it's just saying, okay, Vue is working. So I know that the component is being rendered, but I'm not doing anything all that interesting yet. So we want to do a couple of things. First, let's go ahead and let's start with the idea of how you would do other things. Like the first thing I'm going to want to do is call an API to get the rooms from the server, right? Because I'm not generating them on the client, I'll need an API to be able to access them from the server. And so because Vue doesn't have a networking stack, you're going to need to use one of the hundreds out there. I'm actually going to use Axios. And so because this is ECMAScript 2015, maybe it's 2018, I can't remember exactly, then I'm going to need to import these. So I'll say import Axios from Axios. And right now it's not going to know about it because I actually don't have it included in my package.json. So I'll just include it here. And then I'll quickly just npm install, make sure I have it. There is an issue with Visual Studio currently. I'm hoping they'll fix it soon, that it only recognizes an npm file in the root directory. And there are ways to make your Vue app in the root directory, but I've actually found just doing it by hand is easier than waiting for Visual Studio to catch up and trying to shove everything in the root directory. So let's close that. And normally you wouldn't need to stop and restart this, but because we changed the dependencies, it doesn't know that the dependency has been changed. But we can see what happened is it immediately showed this failure in this build screen. So let me just stop it and restart it. And I love that it tells you exactly what we actually needed to do to fix it, right? Install Axios and save it so it's in the file. That's weird. Should always press save before you run npm install. I hadn't saved this file. It still couldn't find Axios. I think half the fun of watching me do a demo like this is when things don't go well, and you can see I'm human too. Kind of my favorite part of it all. Okay, we have Axios, and so it's grayed out here because we haven't used it yet. So we're going to use, there's going to be methods that we'll end up using, but there's also another kind of thing that's called, these are events that happen, and there's created and mounted, and there's a few others, but mounted is the one you'll probably use most, that says, when this component is mounted, I want to run some code. So you can think of it sort of like a constructor for a class, but for a visual element. Notice it's not in methods. It's on the same level as these methods. So not a lot. There's maybe 5 sections plus a couple of other things that get added. So this isn't going to get that big. But now that I have mounted, what do I want to use? I want to use Axios to get API rooms. Luckily, I know that's what it's called, and there's no other parameters. And this returns a promise, so I could, do then if you're familiar with that. Or of course, since this is all being rendered back into ES5 for the browser, I can use modern JavaScript techniques. So I'm actually going to use async await, right? Now, if you're mostly a C# programmer, I know your eyes might be hurting right now. That I'm using async and await here, but it super works. And then once it's done, what am I going to do? I'm going to say this dot rooms equals result.data. Just going to assign the data I'm getting from rooms into the rooms, and let's see what happens. Let's get rid of this view as working, and let's just do a quick div. And I'm just going to put, at the div level, I'm going to say v4, which is a for each. So it wants to repeat this div every time. And that for is going to be r in rooms. So I'm creating a temporary variable called r, and I'm going to iterate through the rooms of my data element. And so I can just say r.title, which is what I called for some silly reason the name of each room. I still don't know why I did that, but I still fixed it. And so at first, it's going to render this empty, because rooms is just an empty array right now. But as soon as we assign it, it will know that data has changed and re-render it for us. So let's see if it works. Let's see if I haven't typed something weird. And we can see, even though it's stuck next to each other, I don't know why the div in the row would be that way, but we're seeing both of these. We're seeing the varsity and the omni. So what I am getting it from the server and doing it in the right way. So let's go back to our index, and let's comment out this entire section. Because we no longer use the server side, we're just going to use our side. And in this case, I'll comment out the stuff we were using before as well. And I'm going to borrow all of this code, right? Because the code that I'm going to show in my app isn't going to be much different. So instead of title, let's just do what we were doing on the server, right? All I did was create this, and I no longer need the row. I have a row before me. And all I need to do is change the server-side syntax to the client-side syntax. So let's come back to the source suit. I can explain that. But for the rest of these, it's just putting in the double curly braces, getting rid of the @ sign, and then, of course, everything is camel cased from the API, so I need to make those changes, right? And so this is really very similar to what you might do in Razor. Syntax is vaguely different, but try to make that M and max. And notice in this case, I'm not getting rid of that $. I'm just telling it to render the $. First and then render this after it. So it doesn't have to be all of what's inside of an element. It's just this part of that page. Sort of magically makes that work. And if we've done it right, which we didn't. What didn't it like there? Oh, yeah. We need to have a container before the v4 because it might not be rendered at all. Sorry, that's just a little peculiarity in the way templates work. And it's trying to, oh yeah, I forgot to do this one. So in the case of source, logically, we should be able to do this in source, right? That makes sense. And because this is isn't C# anymore, I'm going to actually say just get the first image, right? But that's not really what happened. Because attributes are different from just data inside elements, we have a different syntax, and that syntax is vbind. Vbind is basically saying, I want whatever is in here something that's going to be a binding statement that I want you to resolve for me, just like this is a binding statement that I want you to resolve to me here. But luckily, there's a shortcut. You don't need vbind. You can just say :source, so that the source of what you're looking at is much clearer, and then you can really use that colon to identify it. This is, again, a stylistic thing. Some people put vbind everywhere because they want to really be able to see what's being bound. And some, like me, like to use the shortcuts wherever possible. It's building correctly, so let's go back and run this. Let me make it much smaller. For some reason, it's stacking them. I'll figure out what that is in a minute. But you can see we're getting all that same data. I have something weird going on with the bootstrapness of it, but we're seeing that same idea. So let me fix that real quick, just so I can feel better about myself. I will actually just put room here, and row here, and I think that'll fix it. Yeah, I still don't know why it's not as wide as it should be, but there are reasons for it all. Let's go back to this index, and let's just get rid of this and this, and I think that'll solve it. Nope, didn't solve it at all. But I'll do that before I send you guys the demo. But I'll be able to sort of continue what we want to do. So we've got this app working. And there's a couple of things we can talk about. Let's see how much time we have, real quick. Oh, good. We've got 20 minutes. So let me talk about sort of the interactivity of this. So if I come up here, let's do it on the bottom. Create a new div, and I'm going to create like we did before, I'm going to create a button. In this case, actually, this isn't what I want to do. There's even a better demo. That is the Book Now button. So I showed you before that I could use the v-on for the click event, right? Well, what's interesting here is, first of all, I do want to show you that there is a shortened version of this syntax as well, and that's just an @ sign. So @click versus :attribute. Those are the two that are sort of shortened. And here I'm going to say book room. But when I say book room here, for what I want it to run, I'm going to pass in the R. Instead of, when book room gets called, instead of trying to figure out what row this was called, I can actually send the state that represents this entire row or this entire object. And that way, my code down here in methods for book room will have all that state. So I can just say alert. You should never use alert. It's awful, but in this case, I'll do it. Is I have access to the entire object of state that's being passed in. And so let's see if this works. That's the varsity. That's the omni. And so in this way, I still can have code that is very ignorant of where it's being called. The fact that in my And my template, this happens to be a button, is just a side effect, right? This could be being called for any number of reasons. I can design, when I'm designing my UI, I can make those decisions about it. So let's talk about components real quick, because we've really just created one sort of simple page. And if I was doing something like a contact page, I might be done here. I might just create a simple contact page where I'm validating data before I send it back to the server to send an email to support or whatever. In this case, I want to create something that I might reuse. And so what I'm going to do over here in sources, I'm going to create a new, I'm going to create a folder just because that's been my pattern. And I'm going to create something called a wait cursor. And I'm going to create it as a Vue object as well, though you certainly could just use JavaScript and CSS to do it. By the way, the template and the script can have different languages, so you can use markup to create markup. If you're used to doing things like Node, where that's more common, you can use that as your template language. And the same with script. You can use TypeScript or other languages for that script as well, as long as they're compatible with compiling themselves down. It's a whole plugin to allow you to do that. But of course, I'm not going to do that. Just going to start with the export default like we had before. And in my template, I'm just going to have a simple div. And in that div, I'm going to create another div, just because normally templates, especially in Vue 2, require there to be one parent. And I'm going to say, please wait. And I'll see if I can get lucky with Font Awesome here. FA gear, FA spinning. Let's just say spinner, that's good enough. Please wait, right? So I don't actually need a script block yet, because all I'm doing is having some reusable template put in here. And I'll go ahead and give it a bootstrap alert dot warning. So I've created a very simple component, just markup at this point. And how do I use it in Vue? Well, first, I import it as wait cursor. If I could type components wait cursor. Components wait cursor. Yeah, great. And then there's another section here where I'm just going to say components. These are the components I need in my app. You can create global components as well. I'm just doing this here to make it simple. And I'm just going to wait cursor as a component I can use on a page. So what does that do? That allows me to come up here and right before the card say wait cursor. And that is how in the markup our component gets injected into the page. So we come back here and refresh. We'll see, because it was inside the for, we're actually getting both of these, and obviously I've screwed up the Font Awesome name, but that's okay. That part's not as important. So let's come back here, and since it's over this, let's put it over the for each, so there's only one, and now we have a please wait, right? First thing I want to do is actually be able to make this a little more customizable. So inside my template, instead of setting data here, I'm actually going to set up what's called props. And this is something special about components. These are being able to send down data from the parent to the child. And the first one I'll call is message. Now there's a more complicated syntax where you can define the type as well, but for now I'm just going to do that. And then I'm just going to say, just like any other syntax, go ahead and say message here. And then in my actual component where I'm using it here, what do? I say message equals loading, right? And because I'm putting it in my component here, I'm allowing this version of the component that's on the page to be customized for this use. So if I've done this right, it now says loading, because I'm passing this from the parent to the component. Well, that's fine for like simple properties. What about the last one I'll show you, is one called busy. What are we going to do with busy? We're actually going to put here on the alert, we're going to put a v.if, which is another of those Vue statements you can use. And if says, if this exists, if this is true, if whatever is in the quotes is true, show this. Otherwise, don't show it. So what am I going to put here? I'm going to say busy, right? Because I only want this to show up when our component is busy. How am I going to use it here? Well, what I want to do is really be able to say bind to busy. This is different than what I did here where I was passing in some static piece of content. But here I need to bind to busy to a new property on our data called isBusy. And why is that interesting? It's interesting because if I add isBusy here to the data, and let's make it false by default, I can then use it here to say, try finally. Of course, it's not going to work. Let's put a little try catch here. You'll see why in a minute. So here I'll say this dot is busy. I'm not talking to the component directly. All that happens in the markup. But I'm going to say, you know, I want this to show that it's busy because, whoops, I'm doing this all in the wrong one. Sorry. Almost there. Down here where we're actually doing something like a network request. So here I'm going to say, set the flag to busy because I'm making a network request. Get the rooms, and when you're done, whether an error occurs or not, I'm going to say isBusy equals false. Make it go away again. And so this way I can have some logic here that then passes its way down. And because this is bound every time isBusy changes, the component will get re-rendered to know whether it should hide itself or not. And so in this case, the loading should just flash ever so quickly. And there's no way you're going to be able to tell halfway across the world that it showed up for 1 millisecond. I'm positive of that. But if I, let's do it this way, just so you can trust me. There's only 50% chance this will work, so I apologize if it doesn't. Oh, actually, this is a good chance to talk about this. If you haven't done Webpack before, Webpack inside the browser debugging will actually show you your different pieces. So here's that app view, and I will be able to actually look at where isBusy turns false. Let's set that as a debugger, and let's refresh the page. And you'll actually see loading is being shown here because we haven't turned it off yet. Once we run it again, it'll disappear. Let's get rid of that breakpoint. There are Vue-specific tooling for both Chrome and Firefox, and probably will work with the Chromium version of Edge as well, so you have the ability to look at more complex ideas. And the ecosystem around Vue is pretty mature. There are state managers, there are ways to do routing so you can have multiple pages inside of a single sort of component, etc. There's a lot of these different pieces. So let me go back to the slides for a minute and then we'll start taking questions. So Vue 3 is in beta right now. When I say in beta, I seriously mean in beta. They're dropping a new beta version almost daily. They're using it sort of as their daily builds. And so there are some things that are changing, but there's nothing, they're not breaking backward compatibility at all. They're introducing some ideas that they stole from React. They're making sure that TypeScript support is there. They're moving away from some of the globalness of it. And they're introducing a new way to create that Vue object called the composition API, but I'm not going to dive into how all that works. But just know that Vue 3 going forward is going to be completely compatible with V2, mostly complete. There may be 1 or 2 small code changes, but their goal is complete. And then all the features in 3 will be backported to 2 after 3 releases in case you want to stay with 2 and then opt into some of these new features. So let me head over to the chat window. If I can find it again. Chat. Anyone have any questions that you didn't put in chat? Because the only 2 were remarking about my clockwise rule. which is awesome as I think it is, probably in a question. And I can put it all to, can open up your voice as well if you want to ask me direct questions. Anyone? There was no way I was that clear. Oh, when do you opt for Vue versus Angular? So Mark had the question of when do you opt for Vue versus Angular? It really comes down to project size. Angular sort of doesn't actually require, for the most part, you're going to be doing in TypeScript. So sometimes it's a skill set issue of the organization I'm dealing with. But also if they're really replacing some monolithic app with a monolithic app, using Angular isn't a bad idea. I prefer Vue in most cases, but there is, depending on your team, if there's reluctance to learn new things and they've already have experience with Angular, or your organization wants to get everything from one vendor, Angular is a really good choice there because kind of everything you need, well, most everything you need is in the box with Angular. They have their HTTP stack and their routing stack and their et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, even the way they support things like progressive apps and things like that. So there was a question about when having components within components, there may be conflict between the names of properties. Do the no rules of most local scope winning out apply? It's hard for me to say because all those names are scoped to the components themselves. I've never actually run into a naming issue. So I think that's probably true. What you're saying is the most local applies. It just hasn't, I don't do a lot where we have to sort of reach out into other components. My philosophy is unless you have a spectacularly good reason, and there are reasons, you should only be reaching down into a component, not back up to the parent. Reaching back up to the parent, you can do that with events. But again, naming conventions shouldn't really affect you. There's also a pub sub system for doing app-wide events in Vue, though you can certainly bring your own in. They don't really care. It's just another component that they support. But when you're talking about sort of app-wide things, you're going to want to use something like pub sub instead of having property and event and method names anyway. Hope that answered your question. Anyone else? So question was, do I have experience with Vuex and any comment on using that? Yes, so Vuex is a system they've built for handling state management. And it is so eloquently simple that I actually do a talk on it about how to use it. But after trying to do the same thing in React and in some ways trying to do the same thing in Angular, I found its simplicity refreshing. I'm a huge fan of it. And once I have more than 2 or 3 components, I'm almost always bringing in Vue and then creating essentially a state manager that works across the application. It provides things like safety, so you can make sure that state is never manipulated directly, only through actions, and it simplifies a lot of your state management, so you don't get into race conditions when everyone has access to global data, which is how this has been handled in other cases. So I hope that answers it. Great. Can you do hot reload for development? Yes. So what I was showing you wasn't doing hot reload. I believe you can turn that option on or off, and I will just do, I will use the browser automatic refresh stuff that a lot of people use. I tend to not build anything big enough that hot reload is helpful, but that's actually a part of Webpack, and because the Vue CLI just uses Webpack, you can certainly turn that on. Any other questions before I hand it back to David? David? Yeah, David. Whenever I say it, I'm always afraid that I have the wrong name.
I know how you feel.
Well, thanks everybody. If you missed any of this because you came in late, I will be posting this onto my YouTube channel and my blog. So let me share the screen one last time. And just show you the two links that you may need. Vue.js.org is where you're going to get all of this, and the demo as well as the screen version of this will be on wilderness.com, hopefully tomorrow. And when I say tomorrow, I mean Wednesday, but it'll probably be Thursday your time.
Well, thank you very much, Sean. I'd like you to imagine everybody joining me in applauding you and thanking you for presenting to us and giving up your time.
I appreciate it. I mean, I had fun. I will admit that I wanted to do this because I've watched way too much of Gogglebox Australia to not to want to know how it is down under. I have been to a couple towns, but not Adelaide yet. Next trip down, I will definitely come. No, I used to think Adelaide and Alice Springs were the same place, so that is an embarrassing thing.
Yeah, well, I guess we're both sort of in the middle of the continent, but we're further south.
Opposite. Yeah, so, I know that now. But when I was there, I kept on referring to Alice Springs as Adelaide as being up north, and I just get quizzical looks.
That's all right. No, definitely. Hopefully, when sort of conferences and international travel resumes, it would be great to have you back in the country.
I'd love that.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, and thank you everybody else for joining us today. Appreciate everybody coming on. There's a few new faces, a few people probably not from a .NET background that were interested in learning about Vue. So we definitely appreciate everybody coming on. I hope you got something out of it, and thank you again, Sean.
Thanks.